One morning, Gregor Samsa wakes from restless dreams and discovers that his body has transformed into a gigantic insect. The horror of the scene doesn't lie in his desperate reaction, because there is none. What's striking is the natural way he tries to carry on with his day, as if the absurd were just another difficulty among many. This is how The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka introduces us to its unsettling universe, where the logic of the world remains intact even as reality falls apart. Gregor is a traveling salesman who financially supports his entire family. He's trapped in an exhausting routine with no time for himself, no space to question the meaning of his existence. His identity is built entirely around duty. Everything about him revolves around usefulness, paying off his father's debts, maintaining the household standard of living, ensuring everyone's stability. That's why his transformation not only removes him from practical life, it dehumanizes him in the eyes of those who once depended on him. The father, authoritarian and frustrated. The mother, fragile and incapable of handling disruption. The sister, initially affectionate, still innocent, but soon consumed by the demands of the household. Each of these characters is gradually exposed, not to Gregor's monstrosity, but to their own inability to embrace what deviates from the expected. Gregor's physical transformation is, in truth, the trigger that reveals what was already there. Indifference disguised as affection, the discomfort Kafka invites us to face, isn't with the diseased body or the repulsive appearance. It's with how easily we turn away from someone when they stop fulfilling the role we assigned them. The Metamorphosis isn't a fable about monsters. It's an accusation of how cruel we can become when someone stops being functional. The family's first reaction to Gregor's transformation isn't empathy, it's terror. The grotesque figure now occupying his room shatters all references to what is acceptable. He no longer speaks as before. His body no longer responds the same way. And even though he tries to stay calm and show he means no harm, his family only backs away as if facing a threat. The transformation reveals the exact moment where affection begins to dissolve, the instant the other becomes incomprehensible. Freud, when speaking about unconscious impulses, pointed out that repressed fear often turns into anger. And that's exactly what happens within the Samsa household. The initial fear, which might have inspired care, quickly turns into hostility. There's no attempt to listen, to adapt, to have a dialogue. There are locked doors, hurried footsteps, meals pushed aside in haste. The home, which once revolved around Gregor's routine, begins to reorganize itself to contain him, to hide his presence, to forget him. The change in dynamics is clear. Once the provider, Gregor is now the destabilizing element. His body, barely able to leave the bed, becomes the target of all uncomfortable glances. But the discomfort doesn't stem from what he does. It comes from what he represents, the collapse of order. Kafka shows how fear, when left unprocessed, becomes something more aggressive. The home slowly transforms into a place of tension, where any movement from Gregor is seen as a threat. Fear, when not digested, doesn't paralyze. It destroys. What begins as fear soon matures into contempt. Gregor, though still capable of thinking, feeling, and trying to communicate, starts being treated like a useless burden. His sister, who at first entered his room with some care, begins to rush through everything, avoiding even looking at him. His mother cries, but takes no action. The father, who had lost his authority when he depended on his son, now regains his power by becoming the new provider, and he wields it harshly. The most violent moment in this descent happens when Gregor, leaving his room to observe the family, is brutally struck by an apple thrown by his father. The wound never heals. The apple remains lodged in his body, becomes infected, and weakens him day by day. It's a symbolic scene. The aggression is not only physical, but moral. It marks the moment Gregor officially stops belonging. He becomes the internal enemy, the one who threatens order and comfort. The apple becomes the symbol of final rejection. From that point on, his existence is tolerated only as something unavoidable. His presence no longer inspires pity or fear, only discomfort. And what Kafka shows us, with almost surgical precision, is how exclusion manifests silently, in the everyday. There's no scandal, no ongoing violence. There's the draining away of any act of care. Gregor's suffering deepens with the realization that he is no longer loved. And in this abandonment, his identity begins to dissolve until his departure is met not with sorrow, but with relief. Gregor's figure, now far removed from anything human, becomes unbearable, not just because of what he is, but because of what he represents. His grotesque appearance is the trigger, but the root of the rejection lies in the discomfort he causes by breaking away from everything considered acceptable. The mere sight of his ruined body shakes the household's balance, reveals the instability of relationships, and exposes the fragility of conventions. He poses no direct threat to anyone, yet he awakens something far deeper, the desperate need to preserve a facade of normalcy. The fear surrounding his presence is not rational. It's an instinctive reaction to what cannot be understood. Kafka, with brutal precision, shows us how humanity responds to the strange, not with compassion, but with hostility. The creature Gregor becomes might have inspired care, but instead, it provokes only disgust. The house, once a space of shared life, closes in around him like a shell. The curtains remain drawn, and his bedroom door becomes a final boundary between what is acceptable and what must be hidden. This critique extends beyond fiction. It is society that the author denounces, the tendency to eliminate what doesn't fit, to silence what disturbs, to isolate anyone who threatens the illusion of stability. The rejection of this character isn't born from pure malice, but from a deeply human inability to deal with what escapes predictability. The unknown isn't welcomed, it's exiled. And so, through the repetition of ordinary gestures, the strange stops being someone and becomes something to be forgotten. Before the metamorphosis, Gregor was functional. His identity was reduced to his role as provider. Work was his reason for existing. Supporting his family was his silent pride. Even when exhausted, even when exploited, he never questioned it. He fulfilled his duty with diligence, believing that was enough to justify his place in the world. But when his body no longer responds, when he can no longer leave the house, everything that sustained him internally collapses. There is no longer a function, no longer any usefulness, and without that, Gregor doesn't know what's left. The emptiness that follows isn't just social, it's existential. What happens when someone stops being needed? Kafka answers with the silence of the house, the averted gazes, the indifference that takes the place of recognition. Gregor tries to adapt, to hide his appearance, to avoid causing trouble. But every effort is in vain, because his presence no longer holds value. This collapse of purpose is a kind of death before death. It's the erasure of identity, when that identity is tied exclusively to what one does, and not to who one is. Losing his work also means losing language, touch, connection. Gregor can no longer express what he feels, and because of that, he gradually stops knowing who he is. How can someone who was trained only to produce reinvent themselves when they lose that function? Kafka leaves the question open, but through Gregor, we feel the weight of not finding an answer. Gregor was never a free man. He was a role made, flesh. His entire existence orbited around the function he performed. As long as he could work, His presence was tolerated, even appreciated. But the rigidity of that role, disguised as duty, became his emotional prison. There was no room for desire, doubt, or rest. Everything about him was obligation, routine, sacrifice. After the metamorphosis, the breakdown of his function doesn't liberate him. It disorients him. The absence of a task pushes him into the void. He finds no identity beyond his labor. Practical uselessness becomes symbolic non-existence. No longer being the provider makes him feel disposable, a broken piece in a system that only acknowledges those who produce. And so, the former prison transforms into open exclusion. What once limited him now erases him. Schopenhauer saw suffering as a constant in existence, caused either by lack or by repetition. Gregor represents both. He lived the exhaustion of routine, then the emptiness of lacking purpose. Camus might have spoken of the need to resist absurdity, to reinvent oneself in the face of chaos. But Gregor was never prepared for that kind of freedom. His life was built on imposed roles, not on choices. When those roles collapse, he has no idea how to exist outside them. The deepest pain isn't the family's rejection, it's the impossibility of being someone beyond what he did. And Kafka, portraying this collapse without dramatization, with the sheer dryness of facts, forces us to reflect. How many times do we confuse our worth with our usefulness? How often do we let our roles smother our being? Gregor was crushed by a life where there was no space for himself. It's in the vacuum, left by the breakdown of the social role, that the existential question emerges. What do you do when everything that gave life meaning disappears? Gregor finds no answers. He doesn't search for new paths, because he was never taught that he could choose. His freedom doesn't come as a triumph, but as a sentence. And this lack of direction paralyzes him completely. Sartre once said that we are condemned to freedom, that, without a predetermined meaning, it is up to each of us to create our own. But to do that, we must have internal tools, and Gregor has none. He was trained to obey, not to think, to sacrifice himself, not to express himself. When his routine is taken away, all that remains is emptiness. And emptiness, when not consciously inhabited, turns into suffering. Nietzsche, in proposing Amor Fati, spoke of the active acceptance of fate, even of the most painful aspects of life. Camus, with his image of Sisyphus, saw dignity in the continuous effort of pushing the stone uphill. But Gregor has no stone to push. All he has is confinement, pain, and rejection. His battle is not against the gods, but against being forgotten. Kafka presents no solutions. He offers a raw portrait of the human condition when meaning disappears. The absurdity of life isn't just that Gregor turns into an insect, it's that no one cares. And it's in that silence, in the absence of shared meaning, that his existence dissolves. He doesn't die because he became a monster. He dies because he no longer has a place to exist. At first, even after the transformation, Gregor still tries to maintain some connection. He avoids making noise, hides his body under the couch, listens attentively to the rhythms of the house. Within him, there is a quiet longing to belong, as if there were still a chance of being accepted, even in that new form. But that hope is slowly and cruelly crushed. Every attempt at closeness is met with retreat, silence, or disgust. His sister, once gentle, starts handling things in haste. His father keeps his distance through aggression. His mother can barely remain in the same room. Gregor realizes he is no longer seen as part of the family. He no longer expects understanding. He just doesn't want to be treated like a burden. Gradually, his behavior changes. Submission gives way to small acts of resistance. He drags his body across the room, tries to peek through cracks, wants, at the very least, to be noticed. Not out of vanity, but from a visceral need to be recognized as someone. The anger that begins to grow doesn't erupt into violence. It becomes silent frustration, exhaustion. But even these impulses begin to fade. His body weakens. His mind dims. What remains is a kind of acceptance, without light, without comfort. Gregor's true death begins before the physical one. It is the total loss of hope, the internal surrender. When he finally dies, no one cries. No one breaks down. The house breathes a sigh of relief. His existence had become so invisible that his absence feels like a new beginning, not an ending. What Kafka builds throughout the story is not just a portrait of familial exclusion. It is the full anatomy of unspoken loneliness, of abandonment that is never screamed but whispered through the details. Gregor wasn't thrown out. He was slowly set aside, little by little, until even he no longer knew where he had ended up. And in that process, a kind of rage is born, one with nowhere to go. A silent revolt that cannot be spoken, because no one is listening anymore. The resentment doesn't come from a single act, but from the consistency of neglect. Gregor feels the pain of being ignored not once, but every day, as if he were dying slowly, not because of the metamorphosis, but because of the indifference that followed it. This silent rage is one of the cruelest elements of the narrative. There is no catharsis, no justice, only a decaying body and a soul that is fading. Kafka shows us that the deepest suffering is not the kind that erupts, but the kind no one acknowledges, the kind that stays trapped inside, fed by the absence of attention, by the lack of listening, by the repetition of being forgotten. And this kind of pain, though quiet, transforms those who carry it. Gregor doesn't lash out at others, but he also can no longer feel love. No connection remains, neither within nor without. And that emotional death comes before all others. It is the death of someone who is still alive, but who, inside, has already given up on being. The shame in the metamorphosis doesn't scream, it creeps in. It doesn't explode, it settles. Gregor, even before being rejected by others, begins to feel ashamed of himself. He drags his body into the darkest corners, covers himself with sheets so no one will see him, tries to hide even from his sister. He internalizes the repulsion of others. He begins to believe that his very existence is offensive, that his body is a burden that deserves to be concealed. But the shame isn't only his. The mother, upon seeing him, faints. The father, ashamed of having once been supported by a now useless son, reacts with violence. The sister, little by little, abandons her initial compassion and adopts a harsh stance. Each of them, in their own way, is consumed by shame, but no one speaks of it. And like all things that remain unnamed, it grows in silence, shaping behavior, erasing affection, blocking any possibility of reconciliation. Kafka portrays shame as a social poison, a feeling that paralyzes and destroys not only the one who feels it, but also those who witness it and cannot bear the reflection of what they see. Gregor's presence is not just uncomfortable, it's a mirror of collective failure, of family decay, of dependence and guilt. And for that reason, it must be hidden, silenced, removed. It is out of shame that the family no longer includes him in conversations. It is out of shame that they lock him away, even when he tries to come closer. And it is this shared but never acknowledged shame that turns the home into a toxic environment. Gregor doesn't die of heartbreak. He dies because there is no longer any space to exist without embarrassing others. Gregor's exclusion is not just a personal tragedy. It is a denunciation of the social structures that define belonging. Thomas Hobbes once described the social contract as a means to ensure safety, peace, and stability in society. But Kafka exposes the other side of that contract, the price of acceptance. To belong, one must obey, produce, fit in. Anyone who fails to fulfill that role is expelled, even if they continue breathing under the same roof. Gregor broke no moral law. He committed no crime. He simply stopped being useful. And because of that, the symbolic contract with his family is broken. The logic that governs the household is the same that governs many social spaces. Those who do not contribute are a burden. Those who do not conform become a problem. Those who do not uphold the order must be pushed aside, even if silently. Nietzsche had already criticized the herd morality, where collective comfort is placed above individuality. Kafka takes this critique even further, showing how shame and fear are used to shape behavior, enforce boundaries, and maintain appearances. Conformity is rewarded with acceptance. Difference is punished with invisibility. Gregor, upon transforming, does not just break away from the human form. He breaks away from the system that sustained him. His downfall reveals the rigidity of the structure he once belonged to. A structure where empathy has limits, and affection depends on performance. Kafka doesn't just show us the death of a man. He shows the collapse of a model of coexistence that, instead of protecting, imprisons, and instead of caring, discards. In the end, Gregor departs in silence. His absence is not met with sorrow or mourning, but with relief. The family breathes easier, the house reorganizes itself, and life moves on as if he had never existed. There is no redemption, no comfort, only the emptiness left behind by someone who had already been forgotten while still alive. Kafka didn't intend to write about monsters. He wrote about people. People who, out of fear, shame, or conformity, stop seeing the other as someone. Gregor's disappearance is not just a symbolic ending. It is a portrait of what happens when affection is tied to usefulness and empathy is replaced by the habit of pretending that nothing obliges us to care. The warning is clear. The danger does not lie in grand cruelties, but in the everyday gestures of indifference. When we stop seeing, stop listening, stop welcoming, we contribute to someone vanishing from the inside, long before their absence is ever noticed. And so, we go on believing we are good, even when we have already ceased to be human. Gregor's family seemed to be made up of good people. They never shouted at him, never openly rejected him, but it was precisely these good people who quietly allowed him to be erased. And you? Have you noticed how many Gregors exist around you being silenced little by little?